Hundreds of thousands of Muslim Rohingya have been forced from their homes in Myanmar. The UN is warning of ethnic cleansing. Many have fled into Bangladesh to escape the fighting in Rakhine state. So what's the government doing to end this crisis? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. The UN Secretary General has called on the government of Myanmar to end what he calls the vicious cycle of violence. At least 164,000 Muslim Rohingya have crossed the border into Bangladesh. They're escaping from violence in the western state of Rakhine. But with limited access to the region, it's hard to verify exactly what's happening on the ground. Security officials did take some reporters to still-smoldering Rohingya villages on Thursday. They say the Rohingya themselves set fire to the homes as they fled. We'll get to our guest in a moment, but first, Florence Louis has this report from Naypyidaw.
The column of smoke could be seen from afar. It prompted journalists on a government-arranged trip to northern Rakhine state in Myanmar to request an unscheduled stop. This is what they saw up close. Gaututara village consumed by flames. There's no one and nothing left. The police say everyone in this Muslim village set fire to their homes a day after fighting began, then escaped. In another village known as Alitan Chor, there is a similar scene of destruction and the same explanation.
They burned their own houses and ran away. It began on the afternoon of August 25th.
But the Rohingya who've crossed into Bangladesh seeking refuge tell a different but consistent story.
I am from Mungdo town of Myanmar. There they burnt our houses. They are killing our people, so we have come here across the border.
The military and Rakhine Buddhists are burning our houses. They made us leave our land.
The Myanmar government has defended what's happening in Rakhine as a crackdown on what it calls terrorism. And the country's leader has appealed for patience.
Well, this is one of the biggest challenges that we've had to face, because you know that the situation in the Rakhine has been difficult for many decades. And in fact, it goes right back to pre-colonial times. And I think it's a little unreasonable to expect us to resolve everything in 18 months.
Aung San Suu Kyi's public remarks about the crisis in Rakhine State come nearly 2 weeks after the fighting started. Perhaps an indication that the pressure and criticism from the international community is beginning to bear on the government. There's no indication the fighting has stopped. Sporadic gunshots could still be heard in the distance. Whether fired by fighters or soldiers, it's difficult to tell. But one thing is certain. The exodus of Rohingya fleeing to Bangladesh is likely to continue. This man and his family are headed there. He told us there's nothing left of his village. It's all been burned down. Florence Louis, Al Jazeera, Naypyidaw.
Let's take a closer look at the latest crisis in Myanmar. The government says Rohingya armed men attacked more than 30 police posts in late August, sparking the recent violence. The Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army says it carried out those attacks to protect the minority Muslim Rohingya from state persecution. The government of Myanmar has refused to grant citizenship to the Rohingya, who it considers illegal immigrants from Bangladesh. The World Food Programme is appealing for $11.3 million to support the nearly 164,000 Rohingya who have fled to Bangladesh. Let's bring in our guests. In Yangon, Gabrielle Aron, independent consultant working with development organizations in the country. And in Kuala Lumpur, James Gomez, regional director for the Southeast Asia and the Pacific at Amnesty International. Welcome to you. Or let me start by asking Gabrielle Aron this. Gabrielle, it took Myanmar leader Aung San Suu Kyi quite some time to comment about the crisis. But when she spoke, she said this is just an iceberg of misinformation and distortion of reality. What's your reaction?
Well, I agree in the sense that there is an iceberg of misinformation being circulated from all sides, and it's a major issue that is actually serving to inflame tensions on the ground. We can see that there are wildly different ideas about which subset of information represents the truth, depending on which group that you're speaking to. There are nearly parallel narratives here. And we can see even among circles of respected journalists, diplomats, and others, there is a circulation of unverified information that has become common practice, and the standard of ethics around this have really become an issue.
Mr. Gomez, any reaction?
Yes, I mean, I agree that this is the tip of the iceberg of misinformation, and, you know, I will go straight to Naypyidaw, having spent 3 days in Naypyidaw and, you know, visiting permanent secretaries and ministers from 2 ministries. I can certainly see where some of the misinformation comes from, and that's within the regime. For instance, you know, the minute you walk and sit down into a meeting across, you know, government officials, the first thing they will tell you is, you know, they are inundated with terrorists, and they are unable to, you know, put contours around this terrorist threat. The term is used very, very loosely. In my 2 meetings in the last few days, I've been in Naypyidaw, you know, permanent secretaries, ministers do not hesitate to whip out their handphones and show me pictures of their visits to the Rakhine state, either giving, you know, aid such as milk powder to affected members of the community, or to show me pictures of hospitals where there are, you know, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious patients in the same wards that look clean. Now, all of this doesn't square off with some of the amnesty feedback that we get from the ground.
Okay.
So yes, I agree, there is misinformation, and a lot of it is also coming from Naypyidaw.
Now, Gabrielle, the international community has been denouncing what's happening. Thousands of people forced out of their villages. Some of them are in a limbo area. Some of them managed to get into Bangladesh. Why is the government of Myanmar not able to take an action about this whole crisis?
Well, I mean, in their view, they are taking action. And I think it's important to understand that there is tremendous domestic pressure by constituents across Myanmar who see the situation as really their fears coming to pass. The military also has gained immense popularity by way of this crisis and their role in it. And there's a very delicate balance of power between the civilian and military branches of the Myanmar government. You know, it's important to consider that the response of the civilian government may be trying to preserve that balance.
But then again, I mean, I think those considerations you're talking about should not stop one from saying what's wrong is wrong, and therefore it should be fixed. Mr. Gomez, we keep blaming Aung San Suu Kyi for being silent. Who should we blame? Herself or the government? Or the army, sorry?
Well, I think the first thing is, you know, people expect Aung San Suu Kyi to speak up and speak up on the side of right, and that she has not done so. And that, you know, portion of the blame, you know, lies on her. But at the same time, that blame will not be balanced out if we do not train our sights also on the military, because at the end of the day, they are the deep reins of power. Again, you know, I go back to meetings in Naypyidaw where you have, you know, military personnel now, you know, in civilian roles, you know, not just serving in the higher echelons of the administration, but in the middle and rank and file. They have good networks because they all come from different military training institutes, going into years of relationship. So there is the other side of the blame that I think that's not coming out clearly in the narrative in the last few days. And, you know, for Amnesty International, we want to also highlight the role of the military.
Gabrielle, you've been operating in Myanmar for quite some time. What is the real problem? We know that this has been going on for quite some time. Is it because the community itself, predominantly Buddhist community, does not seem to be really sympathetic with the suffering of thousands of Rohingya people?
Well, I think it's actually really problematic to be talking about blame in the situation in such a way, both with regards to the government and military, not in the sense that they are blameless, but in the sense that we must consider the practical approach versus the principled approach. The government and the military are the only ones really in control of their own response and with the power to set the situation onto a better trajectory. And so antagonizing and alienating them both, it has not been shown to be effective in terms of actually changing behavior. We need to be.
I see your point, Gabrielle, but then they have to be held accountable for what, and I'm quoting here, what the international community, United Nations, different human rights organizations are describing as a systematic ethnic cleansing. Villages being razed, set on fire by the military establishment.
Yes, but accountability I see as a separate issue. At this moment right now, our priority has to be prevention, and our priority has to be, doing whatever we need to reach out to support the military and the government to handle the situation in a way that we see as useful for all parties involved, and especially civilians on the ground. So I think we need to be very careful not to get so caught up in the blame game and the naming and shaming, which, if there were leverage to back that up and to actually to show that there would be some result from all of that, then it would be a different story. But we don't really have evidence in recent history to say that has worked. Culturally and politically, the government and the military are not going to respond well to that. And so we need to make sure that our eye is on the prize, and therefore that we're acting in a practical way.
Now, this raises the question, let me go to Mr. Gomez. What do you think should be done next to de-escalate this crisis and to put an end to the suffering of thousands of Rohingya people?
Well, firstly, I can understand the challenges of the development aid agencies, working on the ground. They want to do good. We know the constraints they have operating from within. So for Amnesty, first of all, is to make sure that international aid gets through to all affected people, and this is what we are, articulating for. We, in our meetings, again, with government officials, they inform us they are dropping aid using helicopters, but we want to be sure that, all sides of the affected communities do get aid. And the only way, we can assure that if international aid is allowed back to the ground. So that's one position. The second position is we do want, access to the ground. We want to have independent verification, and this is what Amnesty is pushing very, very hard. We have 7,000 members. We have now just mobilized them into a digital campaign to bring attention to the issue worldwide, and we want to see more access. In particular, we have the fact-finding mission. We want them to have access to go to the ground and report what is accurate. With that, we can see what we can approach and help the communities affected all around.
Let's bring in our guest in London. Muang Zarni is a scholar and former visiting lecturer in racism, violence and genocide at the Harvard Medical School. Mr. Zarni, why the international community is unable to step up and move beyond the verbal condemnations that we've been hearing again and again?
Well, the international community, so-called, has known this situation that has been in existence for almost 40 years. The UNHCR first got involved in the first exodus of Rohingya refugees that suffer similar but less media-covered events of 1978 from February to June, and about 270,000 Rohingyas fled, the same way today's Rohingyas are fleeing. And I think like UNHCR, as well as the UN special rapporteurs, about 6 of them, they knew the situation, and the UN has known this all along. And since 1992, when the mandate for the special rapporteur to investigate human rights situation in Myanmar was created, primarily, and actually, one of the top reasons for the creation of the UN Special Rapporteur's position on Burma was the concern for Rohingyas. This was back in 1992. So the knowledge is there, the information is there, documentation is there. What is lacking is that nobody on the Security Council finds it in its interest to call the crime by its own name. And, this isn't about, like, how aid is distributed, whether, like, apportioning blame is, like, infuriating the military.
Gabrielle, there are different layers to this crisis. There's the ethnic, religious, there's history, and you have, on the other hand, the ultra-nationalist monks stoking the anti-Rohingya rhetoric. So from a practical perspective, what do you think should be done to win the hearts and minds of the people in the Rakhine state and to bridge this, or at least to narrow this trust deficit?
I mean, first and foremost, I think we need to stop being so polarizing in our language about the situation. We tend to emphasize religion and ethnicity, and that's just feeding directly into the identity politics of the situation. We also tend to paint it as very much sort of Buddhist versus Muslim or Rakhine versus Rohingya. And, I think that this is not a helpful narrative to be pursuing. I think we need to look more at combatants and non-combatants. We need to be talking about how we can find common ground between different groups.
But you know what?
I think it's
Gabrielle, with all my respect, and let me just talk a little bit about this whole issue of the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army. It was established in 2012. The issue has been going on for decades. So just linking this whole thing with the presence of a radical group, it really does not help understand this whole issue.
I'm sorry, I think, the issue is, and how the issue is represented is kind of, those are two different things. And I think that's what we really need to be paying attention to right now. We have had political marginalization of all groups in Rakhine by the central government for decades. That is absolutely true. And many of the more moderate, educated ethnic Rakhine will tell you that they believe that much of the intercommunal conflict that has happened since 2012 has actually been, political play, and there have been different political interests manipulating the situation. Of course, we can't verify any of this, but I think it is important to not gloss over the fact that this is not a religiously motivated or ethnically motivated situation. This is a conflict that's based on decades of political marginalization relative.
Yes, Mr. Zarni.
I disagree.
Can I jump?
Go ahead.
You know what? I came from an extended military family, and between 2004 and until the military blocked the cyclone victims from international even emergency aid, I had worked with 3 successive heads of military intelligence, top senior generals. And I have also worked with President Min Sui when he was head of the military intelligence. My own late great uncle was deputy commander based in Rakhine of all forces in Rakhine in 1959-61, and he was also deputy head of the almost predominantly Rohingya district called Mayu. Yeah, and if you look at the military's writings and rhetoric within the military institution in Burmese language, you will find that military has singled out Rohingya Muslims because of their identity. There are other border-based communities that have cultural and historical ties with different countries, China, and they say that this is the region that had never had Muslim presence. They want to cleanse this region of all Muslims.
Okay, let me
not all the entire country, but this region. This is religiously motivated persecution to the proportion of genocide by the Burmese military.
Mr. Gomez, the United Nations Advisory Commission said in its last report that the status quo cannot continue and that the government should reach out to the Rohingya, giving them a sense of belonging to their country, and particularly when it comes to the citizenship right. Do you think that this is something that the government could ultimately give as a concession to the Rohingya people?
Yeah, well, I think from our perspective, what we have seen, tracking the issues in Rakhine State over the years, is the hardening of discrimination. So some of these spots of violence, and as recent as the one we had, which triggered on 25th of August, is that continuous hardening of discrimination, especially around the Rohingya community. So this is what has brought this state into play. Now, I think moving forward, I mean, the communities are polarized, you know, from many aspects. And one way to move forward is to actually introduce integration policies. Now how that needs to work out depends on whether all stakeholders to come together. But if you look at the military government's perspective, they would want to say, okay, you know, for them, the notion of integration is actually distributing Burmese language textbooks to primary school students, aged students, for example, in the IDP camp, because their argument is that, you know, because this community is based and living in Myanmar, they should speak Burmese language. Now, that's just one side of the argument. I think all communities need to come together to kind of plot out. So you have discrimination, but also you need integration, and for that, you need a kind of a brokered stakeholding approach.
Gabrielle, do you think the recommendations that were presented by the United Nations Advisory Commission could end the crisis and put an end also to the suffering of the Rohingya?
Well, the Advisory Commission was not a United Nations initiative. It was mandated by the government and backed by the Kofi Annan Foundation. But I think that if implemented, the Commission recommendations absolutely will help the situation in Rakhine State. I think it's positive that the government has said that they will form an implementation committee and an advisory board, and that reaffirmed that even in light of this crisis. However, I think that we will have to wait and see the extent to which these recommendations will actually be implemented. I think some of the more controversial sections of the report, like citizenship and freedom of movement, have actually become more difficult because of these recent attacks. And it's unfortunate that the attacks from the ARSA were timed with the release of the report, because that is a pretty big symbolic gesture that appears to say that nonviolent approaches to peace and reconciliation are not of interest to that group at this time.
There's another element to this story that is not really under the spotlight, which we'd like to talk about briefly, if you don't mind. Let me go to Zarni, which is basically there is also a Rohingya community in India, and the Prime Minister of India, in his meeting with Aung San Suu Kyi, said that he supports the government's clamp down on the terrorists. Are you concerned that by seeing this from that particular perspective, the Indian Prime Minister is just helping the government to continue its clamp down on the thousands of civilians?
Well, what we are seeing is the evolution of that rhetoric in terms of framing this issue. Back in 2012, this issue was framed as a communal sectarian violence that was to be expected out when the multi-ethnic community under authoritarian lid opened up, like a la Yugoslavia or Bosnia. And now, what Aung San Suu Kyi government, in partnership with the military, I don't accept the separation between the military and Aung San Suu Kyi. On the Rohingya, they are in sync. Okay, they are in power struggle in terms of democratization, the scope and the pace. But on Rohingya, Aung San Suu Kyi and the Burmese military are on the same page. So now Suu Kyi herself characterizing what is more akin to, say, Auschwitz uprising of Nazi inmates in October 1944 to this fully fledged ISIS-linked the terrorists is just, as Amnesty said, just utterly unconscionable. Now, on the issue of India's Modi, well, Modi is known, Modi has triggered a wave of fundamentalist Hindu racism toward all Muslims in India. And so I think this is very dangerous. A vast, fundamentalist Hindu movement in India and Burmese Buddhist nationalist movement finding a common ground against Muslims across the region. This is dangerous.
Thanks to all our guests, Gabrielle, Aron, Muang Zarni and James Gomez. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the whole team here, bye for now.